So let's jump straight into the next discussion. So for those of you just joining us, I'm Max von Thun. I'm the Europe Director at the Open Markets Institute, and I'm going to be moderating this panel on how we can tackle monopoly power to build a more sustainable, inclusive, innovative, and resilient economy. So in the last panel, we heard a lot about the ways in which economic concentration and monopoly power can affect us and harm us in our daily lives, from increasing the cost of critical food and drugs to lowering wages and working conditions for workers. But with this second panel, we'd like to take the discussion in a more, should we say, optimistic direction and look at how addressing this problem of market concentration could help us build a better economy. And so we'll look at how reining in monopolies could benefit workers and consumers and boost innovation, and we'll talk about some of the practical interventions that we could do to achieve that. We'll also look at whether the EU and Europe more generally already has the powers and the vision that it needs to achieve this, or whether we actually need to look at upgrading those powers, including by looking at what's happening in the rest of the world. So to discuss all of this and more, I'm joined by a fantastic panel who I'll now quickly introduce. So sitting right next to me is Martijn Snoep. He is the chairman of the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets, one of Europe's most high-profile and forward-looking national competition authorities. Next to him is Jan Eekhout, who is an economist and a professor at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And Jan is a leading expert on how market power shapes labor markets, including writing the 2021 book, The Profit Paradox: How Thriving Firms Threaten the Future of Work. Next to Jan is Ariel Izrachi. He is the director of the University of Oxford Center for Competition Law and a leading expert on digital competition and innovation, including writing the book How Big Tech Barons Smash Innovation. And finally, we have Vanessa Turner, who is a senior competition advisor at BEUC, the European Consumer Organization, and a leading advocate for tougher and smarter competition enforcement in the EU context. So let's get started. So Martijn, I'd like to start with you. So obviously, you know, as we approach the end of the current European Commission, we're at a pretty critical moment for competition policy. There's been a lot of progress. We have new powers like the Digital Markets Act. We have a more aggressive approach to mergers, for example, with some big deals being blocked at the EU level, some big antitrust cases, and also a lot of activity at the national level, including at your authority. So, you know, from your perspective, at the head of the Dutch Competition Authority, you know, where do you think we are now? Do you think we're being ambitious enough? Hopefully not. And you know, particularly looking towards the next commission, what would you like to see?
Well, thanks, Max. And maybe let me start by saying how we look at it, you know, from our perspective. And I was a competition practitioner for 28 years in private practice. So I've developed my entire professional life to competition law and competition policy. And I make this distinction because there is a clear difference. Competition law is basically the law that describes our mandate as competition authorities, maybe due processes, the instruments that we have, and competition policy is how we apply that law. And I think in line with what Johannes was saying, the law is much broader than the policy. And that's okay. You know, we talked a lot about the consumer welfare standard. Well, when I started practicing, there was no consumer welfare standard in European competition law. The law hasn't changed since then. So at the time, it seemed, and I understand, it seemed like a reasonable idea to introduce this consumer welfare standard, whatever, and there are many versions of it, because it gave a certain direction for the policy within the broader mandate of the law. Now we are 30 years further ahead, and I think the situation where we are now requires maybe different objectives and different policies within the legal mandate that does not have to be changed. And I think that's where we are as competition authorities. We are on a trajectory to change the policies within the broader scope of the law. And we are now working in different directions, and each authority has its different priorities, but we are getting there. And I think the great thing about this conference and about civil society is that it incentivizes competition authorities to take an extra step and to challenge boundaries and to go beyond precedents. Because I think in the balance of power of the competition debate, there is, of course, a very strong voice from the business community and private practitioners who focus on legal certainty, on due process, and these things are all important. I'm not dismissing it. But on the other hand, we also need civil society and civil society groups to push ahead for a more progressive agenda so that there is a balanced way outside the competition authorities world where we are pushed from two sides into a different direction and hopefully find new ground. So what are things that we are working on as a Dutch competition authority? And you have to keep in mind that the Dutch Competition Authority is not, or the ACM is not a competition authority only. We're also the energy regulator, the telecoms regulator, the digital regulator, the Consumer Protection Agency. So we have a wide mandate. And I think that makes us ideal positioned in what we call kind of a whole of government approach in tackling corporate power. Because that's also how we see it. We are an integrated authority that uses different tools from different toolboxes with one objective, and that is tackling corporate power and bringing value to people and businesses, to bring value of markets to people and businesses. But within the competition mandate, one of the things that we are looking at the moment is how, well, one step back. Over the past few years, we put in kind of sustainability concerns, and Johannes referred to that. So both sustainability as an exemption for possible anti-competitive behavior, but also sustainability as a concern when there is a negative effect on the environment as a result of market power. So it's a two-sided sword. But we're also looking, and I think that's an area where we can do more, at labor markets. What's the impact of market concentration? What's the impact on cartel agreements on labor markets? We've already done a couple of cases against employers conspiring to reduce wages. We're now looking more in what the effect of mergers is on labor markets in one of the merger cases that we are looking at. Second area, media plurality. Media is obviously extremely important in a democratic process. It is extremely important in a counterweight against corporate power, and therefore media plurality is a key issue. And why we are now looking in how to incorporate media plurality in our merger test. And finally, and that's my last point, something that we see now in more and more markets is buy and build strategies by mostly private equity firms, but also by industrial players. So that means bigger players buying up, gobbling up smaller SME companies, trying to get market power either at the local or regional level or at the national level. And I think these M&A strategies are important, an important area to focus on for competition authorities because they can lead to market power depending a little bit on the structure of the merger control system in a way that gets unnoticed by competition authorities because most of these mergers remain below the threshold. And what we are now looking at is whether we can tackle these M&A strategies of these companies in unconsolidated markets in our current merger control test to prevent market power to happen. And this is incredibly difficult because what is the tipping point? Basically, the tipping point, if there is market power, then okay, you can argue that every additional increment should be prohibited. But then basically you are already too late. So what is the increment between not having market power and adding one small transaction in gaining market power? This is a new area, and we haven't found a solution yet. But I think what is interesting, and that comes back to my earlier point, the legal mandate is wide enough to experiment and to see how these things work without having to change the law. Because that, if there is one, warning I can give to the audience and also to the civil society groups is, be very careful if you want to change the law, because the law of the unintended consequences also applies to changing the law. And once that law is, being put up for consultation in Parliament or wherever, it may end up in a way that you do not like.
Beware of what you wish for. Beware of what you wish for, as the saying goes. A lot to chew on in there, and some really interesting insights to the type of work you're doing at the ACM, which would be good to come back to later. So Vanessa, I'd like to turn to you next, and my question to you is similar to the one I originally posed to Martijn. So, looking back on the past 5 years or so, and what we've seen, particularly from DG Comp, what's if you were kind of giving them a score on the report card, what would it be?
That's a very difficult question. I think I would give them quite a good score if we're looking at the last 5 years. If we're going back a bit further, maybe less good. So maybe let me build on a few of the points that have already been raised, because I think it's important that we do look at the scope of the law, and I think both Martijn and Yannis have already touched on this, and I want to build on it, because I'm actually not pessimistic, but rather optimistic about what we have. So there's a lot of emphasis about, do we only look at prices under EU competition law? And I would say no. Do we only have a consumer welfare standard under EU law? I would say definitely no, which gives me this grounds for optimism. But let me maybe explain why in a bit more detail, and it might get a bit nerdy, but I think it's important to go through this. So I think EU competition law has the flexibility to look at all the dimensions of interest to consumers, and obviously I'm a consumer advocate. So we're not just interested in prices as consumers, but also in choice, whether that's choice in relation to sustainability options or choice in relation to privacy options. And I think EU law has the ability to deal with that. Its foundations are actually quite broad and solid, so am I echoing, as Yannis already mentioned. So EU competition law has the ability to look at multiple objectives, not just price. And I want to just go through a few of these that have been recognized in the case law of the court. So EU competition law has been found to recognize protection of consumer well-being as well as welfare, effective competition structures, the protection of input providers, functioning of the internal market and market integration, fairness, and plurality in a democratic society. So I could cite you one or more cases for each of those concepts that I've just listed, but don't worry, I won't. But I will maybe just cite one very recent case from the European Court of Justice, which nicely summarizes the broad scope of interests that EU competition law covers. And that's the Court of Justice's European Football Super League judgment from December of last year. And there it referred to the purpose of competition law, in that specific case, the abuse of dominance, so Article 102, as being, and I quote, to prevent competition from being restricted to the detriment of the public interest, individual undertakings and consumers, and protecting innovation. So I think that is quite a broad scope and picks up on some of the points that were being made earlier. So for me, I think we have the right legal foundation in the EU to rein in market power and improve the lives of consumers and citizens, so agreeing with other speakers. And I think, actually, that foundation will also enable the 6 priorities that Max, that you mentioned earlier. So I don't think we need a radical change in the law, leaving aside the danger of being careful what you wish for. I think the problem is the way that it has sometimes been enforced. So here we come back to how many points do we get. And I think I completely agree with Max with what you quoted from Executive Vice President Steyer, that we need to be bold. We should have been bolder. I think we're getting there, but we should have been bolder. And I think it will be also really important that we resist the things that René Rapazi was referring to in terms of allowing potentially industrial policy, if done the wrong way, to negate the benefits of competition law through overriding competition principles to create European champions, for example. So I think there are a number of ways that we have done things maybe not as well as we could have done in the past, but I think we have turned a corner in recent years, and we see that in digital markets. Just to pick a few cases, the very recent Apple Music streaming case was an exploitative theory of harm. We haven't seen exploitative theories of harm for many decades, apart from in the pharma sector. So I think that's a really good a point for enforcement in the last few years. And similarly, looking at things like consumer behavior in the theories of harm in analysis of cases, I think that's also a really important point. And in merger control, I think other people have mentioned already that we've seen, I think, in digital markets, a turn in terms of taking into account ecosystem issues, as, for example, in the Amazon iRobot case that Margarita mentioned, or indeed in the Booking e-Travel case, as well as recognizing the importance of innovation in cases like Adobe Figma. So I think we are really getting there, and it's also outside of digital. Someone alluded earlier, actually it was Yanis who mentioned the change in taking sustainability considerations into account, which I think was led by Greece and the Netherlands, pushing from the bottom up of the member states up to the Commission level to get things done, but maybe not all the way. So I'm going to give a good score, but certainly not a perfect score, and there are a number of things that I would really like to see done, and I don't know whether I can go into those now, or whether you would like me to pause at this point.
Right, well, thanks for following the brief on optimism, and yeah, I think it would be good to come back to some of those more concrete ideas of how we improve the current system a bit later. But now I'd like to come to you, Ariel. So you've done a lot of work on how concentration, particularly in the technology sector, undermines innovation, despite what we might hear from the big tech companies. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about how that works, about how innovation is harmed by concentration, but also, again, to stay on this kind of more optimistic perspective, how dealing with this concentration could actually benefit innovation.
Thank you, Max. Hi, everyone. Before I comment on innovation, I just want to mention something on consumer welfare, because obviously that's a big theme. And just to share with you, as many of you know, in the treaty we have consumer well-being in Europe. We don't have consumer welfare. And yesterday we had a chat and we were reminded that we hosted in Oxford an event a few years back, and Mario Monti was presenting at the event. And I just think it's a really nice anecdote. So Mario was talking about consumer welfare, and he explained that at the time, he was under immense pressure from member states to implement protective measures or promote national champions. Each person had a different idea about what consumer well-being was. So he imported consumer welfare from the US. He made a decision that consumer welfare will be a limiting instrument that will be really useful. And at that event, he said that in hindsight, he regrets doing that. So we have to remember that competition enforcement is a dynamic process. The fact that at a certain point we thought that one thing is right, or the fact that consumer welfare was built in a certain way, doesn't mean that it should continue exactly like that. But there is a warning that comes with that, and that is that you have to be very careful not to overstretch certain concepts. And another tiny anecdote on that is, when you put something for consultation or when you try to open something for legislation, it's very much like when you have a DIY project at your home and you bring a skip and the skip is on your front drive. You know what you want to throw into that skip, but you never know what the neighbors are going to throw in your skip. So always be wary of that. Now to innovation. The problem that we have is that our version of or understanding of what competition law should be or is has been distorted because of a lot of parties that are driving certain agendas. So what we settled for in terms of a competitive dynamic is very different from what the textbooks would assume competition will yield. And therefore, it is not too surprising that competition doesn't always deliver on its promise. And when you touch on innovation, it becomes even more obvious. Because the way we measure innovation looks at volume of investment, looks at quantities. And at the theoretical level, there are different approaches. Does market power help? Does it inhibit innovation? But even if you find a common ground, and there are well-accepted ideas about what drives innovation, our focus is pretty much on how much money goes into investment. We don't ask about the value of innovation. We don't ask about the nature of innovation. And this is where there is a massive gap in our understanding. More competition, or let's start with less competition, results, especially in the digital environment, in toxic innovation. Less competition results in upstream players dictating the paths of innovation. So you're told a story of disruption, but the real story is about smaller companies that are joining the value chains of larger companies, because it is extremely difficult to get funding otherwise. So what does more competition deliver? More competition can increase the heterogeneity of innovation. It means that what you have is, instead of all the time supporting the value chains of the leading companies, because this is where the money is, you will have real disruption. And that disruption is significant, because real disruption is about different value propositions. It is about increasing the scope of innovation. And if we are successful in reigniting a dynamic process of competition, then the markets will actually deliver. Then there is less need in terms of us intervening, and we will see much more of that. But in markets where you have network effects, markets where you have first move advantage, or when you have markets that have already tipped, it does require an effort. It requires a combination of enforcement and a combination of support policies, meaning the government, the European Union, cannot just sit and expect the wonderful powers of the market to simply deliver. We have to do something beyond that. And do I have another minute? And if we look at AI, because we had a bit of a chat about AI, this is really a lovely area where you see all of this extremely visible. Look at the rhetoric from the industry. There has never been more activity in AI markets. True. There has never been more startups. Absolutely true. And there has never been more money. So that is a story of success. Now, move beyond that facade of success, and you see a story that is slightly different. Because what you see is upstream players that control the interface, control the models, control the data. And what you see is a lot of activity downstream, but that is completely reliant on those models. You see contracts that actually prohibit downstream players from competing directly with the providers. And you see what we refer to as open washing, which is everyone talk about open AI, how everyone have access to generative AI, where in fact what you have is the permit to take whatever you have and plug it to the socket of the power station. You don't have access to the power station. You were just allowed to plug into that. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem when we discuss innovation or dynamism. We have to maybe question sometimes the rhetoric that we are being presented with and ask, what is really happening here? And if what we see is increased dependency, what we see is concentration and a lot of activity, but within the ecosystems that was created, then this is really not the type. It's great. I'm not saying that it's not great, but we should aspire to so much more. We should aspire to competition where you have disruption, where you can have European champions, where you can have activity that really generates the dynamics that will promise future welfare. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think you've made a really convincing case of when we talk about innovation, we shouldn't just treat all innovation the same and take it at face value. We should think about, who is driving that innovation, which corporations, how much power do they have. Great. So Jan, finally, I'd like to come to you. So you're an expert in how market concentration hurts workers in different ways, from lowering their wages, undermining labor mobility, even reducing output in monopolized markets. And we heard in the first panel quite a bit about some of the harms that creates. But from your perspective, if we were to succeed in tackling this concentration problem, how would you see workers being better off?
Well, let me first kind of point out, there's been a lot of interesting things that have been said, and I'm going to come back to those. But let me point out just one thing, which is that why is it that we're talking about many of these consequences that we observe today? And I think the main reason, and this comes out, from looking at it in closer or in greater detail, is that we're seeing a lot of technological change. And what technological change does is that there's a lot of good things. We talk about AI now, but we can talk about, the digital revolution starting about 4 decades ago. It has a lot of good things, and in that sense, in the economy, technological change is both the hero, but also the villain, because, while it produces all these benefits, it also produces a lot of negative side effects, and one of them is that the big players use the technology to somehow reduce the competition, for them, in order to extract more profit rents and basically be more successful from their point of view, which makes the system as a whole less efficient. And so, as you mentioned, there's a bunch of negative effects. What's the positive side? When we look at the tools that we have, and as Martin was saying earlier, there's not really a need to change the legislation. It's just how we implement it. I think there's one important thing that we have seen in the past. I mean, the Dutch authorities, I think, the example for many competition authorities, because they, as Martin was saying, they're not just doing competition, they also regulate electricity, telecom. They basically do everything that has to do with concentration of power. Now, in order to kind of obtain these positive results, what we really need to take into account is that because of the technological change that we've seen, this has an economy-wide kind of effect. It's not just the case that you can look at a breakfast cereal market and see what the effect there is of dominance. We see dominance because technological change, now the digital market or the advent of AI, has really economy-wide implications. And that's why we see things happening in the labor market. That's why we see dynamism go down. That's why we see startups going down. That's why we see these economy-wide implications, because the technological change is economy-wide, and the technological change has a lot of positive effects. But apart from being the hero, it's also the villain, because it reduces competition in many of these markets. And I think that means that also we have to do competition policy, or to try and achieve competition in a different way. I think one of the big problems that we see is that competition policy is very much done in a litigation kind of way for a problem that really requires regulation. That's a problem where we need ex-ante intervention of setting a set of rules. Think of, a football game. If you have a bully who decides the rules and says, I'm going to play with 15 players against the team at 7, and I'm going to make sure that, the field is slanted, and I play on the top and you play at the bottom, then of course you're going to win. And that's a little bit what we see. What a competition authority, I think, should do is make sure that, the playing field is level, that there's 11 against 11, that there's an impartial referee, rather than having, a set of rules that are biased. And I think in that sense, having ex-ante intervention and ex-ante kind of regulation is positive. What we see with the Digital Markets Act is a step in that direction. I mean, it's ultimately ex-ante regulation rather than litigation exposed. Now, the question remains, there's also, is it going to be successful or not? We have the laws now. Are these ex-ante regulation laws, are they going to be implemented? We know from the past that, telecom regulation has been very successful. I think more so in Europe than it has been in the US. We know that regulation of many industries, including energy, has been successful. There's still a much more to be done. With digital, I think it's hard because regulating digital is so specific. Each market is so specific. You know, with energy or with telecom, there's a very kind of, you know, unified technology. With digital, there's many different aspects to it. You know, there's network externalities, there's you know, retail, there's a whole bunch of different aspects of the technology that requires a different intervention for each of them. And I think that's going to be the challenge. Is the DMA eventually going to have the effect that it's being projected to have? Because, you know, we can't forget that there's also a bunch of big players who have a big interest in this not working. I mean, all the dominant firms, they have a huge interest for the DMA not to work, as they have had in the past for, you know, telecom regulation not to work, or for any other regulation not to work. And I think that's where we'll see how strong, you know, the existing legislation is going to be. But it's not about the legislation; it's going to be about the implementation, which I guess ultimately is going to be a political question.
Got it. Thanks a lot. So I'd like to move the discussion. We've touched on some ideas already, but I'd like to move the discussion more in terms of solutions and practical steps that we can take. So staying with you, Jan, for the time being, one of the lines that you had in your book, which really struck me, is you compare dealing with market concentration to putting a man on the moon or the Manhattan Project. So, you know, given the scale of the challenge we're facing, and if you were to give some advice to the next European Commission, what are kind of some priority measures that you would be suggesting to them?
I mean, I think in terms of you know, implementing competition policy, the way we think about a market and how it works is we think, let me use the sports metaphor again. We think about getting 11 great players on each team and investing in the team and making sure that there's innovation, new tactics, new ways of playing. We never think about innovation in, you know, the governance, innovation in the system of how to make sure that the rules are going to be applied. That may be the referee, that may be a VAR, that may be, you know, adjusting the rules all the time. And what we don't have at the moment is, you know, the means to do that. I mean, you know, I think Martin will be able to say that they're really working with a limited amount of resources to implement very complicated new policies. And I think that the first thing we have to stop and think is, how much do we really want this to work? And if you want this to work, we have to create, first of all, I think, an cadre of a group of people who really are, you know, well trained, well prepared, able, and then of course the resources. If I look at from an economic point of view, probably arguably the biggest success story in economics is the independence of the central bank. Until the 70s, late 70s, 80s, we couldn't control inflation. Okay, modular what happened in the last year, but that's a different issue. And so the way we did it was by arguing, okay, you know, because of economic theory, we need independent central banks because, you know, if you mix this with a political process, what's going to happen is that the politicians, like in Venezuela or in Argentina, have an incentive to, you know, increase the money supply. This is going to make the economy very good for a few months. You have an election, you're re-elected, and then 6 months later, you have basically all the negative effects of high inflation. So take it out of kind of the political process, make sure that it's kind of, if you want, a technocratic, which is like a dirty word, but it's an independent process to make sure that there is control of inflation. How do we do it? We spend about 5 billion, both in Europe, in the European system, or in the Federal Reserve System, just about $5 billion or euros on this whole system, okay? What is the welfare cost? What is the cost to society of having too much inflation? People think it's around 0.5%, okay, of GDP. Now let's take a look at what we do with competition policy. With competition policy in the United States, they spend about $500 million. That's 1/10 of what we spend in terms of controlling inflation. Now the welfare cost is around 8 to 10% of GDP. Okay, so we're just factors off in how much we spend, and we're factors off in how much we value the cost of not having enough competition. And ultimately, I think that's the only way that we will be able to implement competitive markets, competitive policies, if we really take serious, you know, regulating and implementing the existing laws with more resources and with, more people and make this kind of a kind of innovative sector as much as the innovation is for the new technologies. Governance is also requiring a lot of innovation.
Great, thanks. And Martin, I'd like to come back to you next. So Jan mentioned a bunch of things that we could do to improve enforcement, more money, having the right personnel, independence, and so on. So, from your perspective, what do you think we need to strengthen enforcement for? I know one of the things that you've been calling for is for a market investigation tool, both in the Netherlands and in the EU. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on that and any other things that you think are needed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are differences between the EU level and the national level. I would say at the EU level, we definitely need more resources because basically DG Competition and DG Connect were sent off on a very difficult mission enforcing the DMA and the DSA and all the other new digital regulation with limited amount of extra staff. At the national level, I must say I'm pretty content with the level of resources that we have at the moment. The good thing is that we are flexible with the resources, so we can shift resources from one group to another. So nowadays we need less resources in telecom regulation, and we can deploy the resources now in digital regulation. So that the size of the agency allows us also to shift resources around, which makes us more efficient. Second, I think in the member states, and again, the situation is different in different countries, is we also face a labor shortage crisis. So we have to think, I think also we have a responsibility as an agency. Do we want to deploy more civil servants in competition policy, or what about the energy transition, or the healthcare crisis, or the problems with with retiring employees in all sectors of the public economy? So I think from that perspective, I do not call upon my government in the Netherlands for more resources, but I would like to have more tools, and two tools are very important. One is something that I already mentioned, is below the threshold mergers, a call-in power. You see that many countries in Europe have now a call-in power, and fortunately the European Commission tried the infamous Dutch clause to get a call-in power at the European level. Hopefully that will succeed with the Court of Justice, and if it doesn't, that may be one of those exceptions that require a change of the law. And we would like to, we do not have a Dutch clause within the Netherlands, funnily enough, but we would like to have a similar power to get our hands on smaller mergers. So that's one. Second is the market investigation tool, or the new competition tool. I think originally it was introduced at the European level as the new competition tool, which was the predecessor, what later became the DMA. I think we need to go back to the original idea. It was a great idea. There is an enforcement gap in situations where markets are not sufficiently competitive, and intervention is needed. Not intervention by regulation in the sense of regulating an entire market, but by targeted interventions done by an independent competition authority. And I think it would be great to have that at the European level and at the national level. This has been picked up at the national level. So you see that now many countries, like, for example, Germany, Greece, Italy, Scandinavian countries are either they have a new competition tool, or are they thinking about a new competition tool. But that now we get to a new problem, kind of a second order problem, is that will this lead to a fragmentation of the European internal market? And I think there is a serious threat to that. So therefore, it is important for those markets that are prone to member state trade, that the European Commission has similar powers and can make interventions at the European level to ensure that the benefits of a single market remain there and are not be fragmented by national interventions with a new competition tool. So my wish list is relatively short. but in my opinion, very effective for the future Commission.
Thanks, and I'm very pleased to hear that ACM is happy with the financial resources it has. I think that's not so common with government agencies. So Vanessa, I'd like to come to you now. I saw you nodding vigorously when Martijn was talking about more resources for the Commission, for example. But it'd be good to hear your thoughts more broadly on what, I'm sure BEOC has lots of priorities and recommendations for the next Commission. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Thanks. Yes, I mean, I was optimistic beforehand, but there is a but, and there are things that I do think we need to do to improve competition law enforcement. And I divide it into two. I would start with what we have in our toolbox and how we use it, and then come into new law. So I think it's really important that we the Commission makes full use of its toolboxes, both in antitrust and in merger control. And I put that into three buckets. First of all, in terms of evidence, its evidence toolbox, I think the European Commission needs to make, and actually some member states, make greater use of behavioral economics, so behavioral insights, how consumers actually behave. I mean, I indicated that we have seen some of that in some of the cases, but because it can be used by powerful companies to steer consumers to take decisions in the interest of the companies rather than in the interest of consumers and citizens, it's really important that we look at that systematically in any consumer-facing markets. The second area that I think should be systematically considered in cases, in particular in mergers, is financial analytics, to better understand how the company's incentives and to test theories against actual financial data, in other words, following the money. I think that needs to be systematically looked at as well. So that's two things I would call out and how we need to improve things in terms of evidence toolbox. In terms of the procedural toolbox, which is the next one I want to look at, antitrust cases take far too long, and then markets can tip, as we've heard already. Now, we need to try and do something about that, because otherwise the damage is already done. One of the things we could do about that would be to make greater use of so-called interim measures, and there I think we can learn from the French Competition Authority, which has been successful in using those. So that's one thing I would wish for at the Commission level. But I'd also want the Commission to work out why it is, and maybe Martijn can answer this, why is it that some member states can actually bring cases more quickly than the Commission? What's delaying things at the European level? Because it's going to be important to resolve delays if we can. Then another very important thing that I think also goes to the priorities of your manifesto, and that is we need to pay much more attention to effective remedies to prevent further market concentration in the first place, and then to tackle anti-competitive harms. And those remedies may well need to include structural unbundling type remedies in some cases. And I think there's many ways that we can improve remedies. One would be looking more broadly at what options there are, but another would be to involve third parties more in the design of remedies, and by that I also mean civil society. So those are kind of my wish lists for the toolbox that we have and that just needs to be used better. But then I do think we need to supplement this toolbox. And first on my list is market investigation tool, for all the reasons that have already been said. And I think it's important that we do have it at the European level. Otherwise, we're going to have unequal protection of consumers in different member states, which is also not good, or it's an element of market fragmentation. And then the second thing where I think a change in the law is warranted would be to do something about restitution for consumers and citizens when companies have harmed them through abuse of market power or other competition law violations. Today, competition law damages actions are largely ineffective. For consumers, maybe not for business, but for consumers they are. And I think they're going to remain that way, i.e. ineffective, unless we have collective redress, so kind of class actions, to use an American term, at the EU level. Now that will require a change in the law, whether it's a change of the damages directive to include collective redress, or adding competition law into the Representative Actions Directive, which does allow representative bodies to bring claims on behalf of society. So I think that would be an important reform. And the other alternative, or actually addition to that, would be to include some form of restitution for consumers and citizens when antitrust enforcers take settlement or commitment decisions to close a case. So I think those would be my wish list for improving things for society.
Great. Some very practical ideas there, and also great to hear that there's a lot of overlap with what we're recommending in our manifesto. But before I come to Ariel again, Martin, I was just wondering if you wanted to respond to what Vanessa was saying about this question of speed and the ability of different authorities, to launch and resolve cases quickly.
I must say I have the same question as Vanessa. Sometimes I go to my own staff and ask them, how on earth can Johannes do, how many dawn raids in 1 year, and we have difficulty getting 3 or 4 done. But I think and we talked about it, and we also talked at the ECN level, and there is a variety of reasons. First of all, I think you have to look at the workflow of competition authorities. If you have at the moment, 4 phase 2 merger investigations, it leaves less room to start an antitrust investigation, and so competition authorities are not exactly on the same wavelength when it comes to merger enforcement, for example. Second, it's a question of simply boldness. Some competition authorities are more careful than others. That doesn't mean if you're more careful that you're a coward, because then you come to the third option. We all have different courts, and some courts are very strict, and the other courts are a little less strict. So that can also influence your boldness and your ability to bring boldness to actually a fruitful intervention. So I do not have the clue. I wish I had. Maybe it is something for academia to do kind of a cross-regulator research to see what works, but I think it's part of our job, and I see as the management of competition authorities, to improve the effectiveness of the authorities. We are now, for example, thinking about how AI can improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of our work, and also to speed up our interventions. We're in the early stages of that, but I think innovation is also a requirement for competition agencies to see how we can improve our action and expedite our interventions.
Great, thanks. And that brings me nicely back to Ariel. So Ariel, coming back to this question of innovation, I'd be curious for your thoughts on taking your point that it's not just about the quantity of innovation, but the type of innovation we want. So for example, in generative AI, we don't necessarily want AI just reinforcing surveillance advertising, right? But how can we operationalize that idea in competition enforcement so that competition policy actually creates more beneficial innovation? So yeah, your thoughts on that, and also anything else that the others have raised.
So I'm aware of the time. So what I'll do is I just collected few points because there were so many good comments that were made, and part of it will also answer your question, but also maybe add to the general mix. I think we all appreciate that we need flexibility. We need flexibility in enforcement, and the problem that we have is that high tech works. I mean, if we use that as an idea, 3 times faster than normal industry 3 times faster than competition agency, courts 3 times slower than competition agency. So you have a really nice spectrum, and you start to understand the gap. So even when the competition agency is brave and taking a step forward, the problem is, and this comes to your point, that sometimes the court are still in yesteryear jurisprudence, and the courts are the ones that are blocking because they're thinking and using case law, which is what they're supposed to do. So the rhythm of change at the court is much slower than the rhythm of change at the agency, which is by definition only chasing the rhythm of change at the industry, which brings us to the idea that competition law, as valuable as it can be, and the fact that it's very versatile and can be used as a gap filler, cannot be used to fill very wide gaps. It just doesn't work that way. And this is why we need other instruments. And this is where you come into regulation. But here again, you have the problem of flexibility. Because if you have something like the DMA, which is very impressive, but in a way, it codifies a lot of old decisions, and it does what we know about the market, what we understand about technology. Then what it does, it draws ex ante the boundaries of what is acceptable, but it is still following whatever happened yesterday. So you have other versions. You have, for example, the UK version, that it might be a bit more adaptive, but still, then you go to the UK or go to national levels, and we go to another point, that whereas the EU can focus on what they're trying to achieve and maybe disregard to some extent industrial policies or foreign direct investments, the smaller your economy, the less you can behave in a way that is immune from other pressures. So you're captured in a way, which brings us back to the discussion with which we started of market power. That's the problem of power, that suddenly everything shifts around and it's much harder then to do the right things because you are, in a way, operating already in an economy that has tipped in favor of certain incumbents. Market investigations, I think, are an amazing tool, but they tend to be a one-off thing. So in the context of what we describe now, let's say you do something now on AI. So you spent your year, you have your things, but they keep on going. And this is why, if we are trying to imagine the way forward has to have a built-in flexibility. And that flexibility will enable us to adjust, will enable us, we'll always be slightly behind, but to follow a bit closer to the development. I think we're very much focused on enforcement and regulation. We have to remember that there is always a risk that we're overdoing things, that basically we're creating such a burden, which is the general argument in Europe, that might even chill innovation and chill activities. So it's a very delicate act. It's a very delicate dance that we're trying to do here. Support policies, more regulation, remove regulations that are not necessary. And in a way, it will always be us chasing something until we find a way to regenerate competition. The solution at the end is by regenerating innovation and competition, because just by state intervention, there are some natural limitations to the process. Last comment, enforcement capacity. This is by far the greatest limiting element that we have. You have deep, endless pockets on one hand. There is the ability to exhaust the agencies. There is the ability to flood them with information. There is the ability to distract by having a certain case. And while there are a lot of stories of success across the board, always ask yourself whether that success actually triggered a change in the dynamics of competition, or whether all we have is something that we can maybe celebrate, but the train keeps on moving in a certain direction.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but obviously we've discussed some really fascinating issues, and I'm sure we could go on for hours, but we've already eaten up 2 minutes of the coffee break, so we'll have to call it to a close then, but if I could just ask everyone to give a round of applause to our fantastic panel.